here that we in chapel are talking about what Jesus is like, right? That's what I've been asked to talk about, is to come here and to express something or to explain something about Jesus, about who he has revealed himself to be in Scripture and who he has revealed himself to be to me, in order that you guys might also see what Jesus is like, and that you would continue to be able to grow in faith and continue to be able to understand who this Jesus that we worship truly is. And so that's what we're going to look at today, is we're going to look at a very specific aspect of Jesus' character, at a very specific aspect about who he is and what he's like. And I don't know if you've ever considered it before, but as a disciple of Jesus, as a follower of Jesus, as a Christian, we are to look at Jesus and to aspire and to admire to be like him. And so hopefully there are things about Jesus' character and things about what he is like that you have seen, and then you say to yourself, well, I want to be like that too. And I would give you the opportunity to share what those things might be, but I'm the one wearing the microphone, and so I get to decide what we're going to talk about today. And the aspect that Jesus is like, that I want to be like, is Jesus is a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. Okay, stop there. So if all we saw here was just Jairus' story, we wouldn't know that much really about him. But what we're going to see is that Jairus, this guy, his story is going to be interwoven with another person pretty soon. But first, I just want to point out some things that we do learn about Jairus in the very beginning here. The first thing we learn about Jairus is that, one, he's a man. And it's pretty obvious, right? But that's pretty significant. And being a man in the first century, when Jesus was on the earth, was very significant, especially socially, and especially when it comes to your abilities to work and move and to do things. And so immediately, just by nature of being a man, Jairus has a sense of power and authority and of function. The other thing is that the story here tells us Jairus' name, doesn't it? His name is Jairus. And I don't know if you've read through much of the Gospels and you've noticed that oftentimes when the Gospels tell stories about people, they don't always give us their names. They'll often just say, okay, a Pharisee or a teacher this or a leader that or a man this or a woman that, and they don't always tell us their names. But the fact that the gospel writer here chose to give us his name, Jairus, means that his name was significant. It was important that people would have known his name. He wasn't just some guy, he was Jairus. And people would have known this name. He was important, and his name mattered. And the reason that his name mattered and that he was important was that it tells us here that he's a ruler in the synagogue, right? A synagogue leader. And so he had this position of power and he had this position of influence in the synagogue. And so Jairus had this power here. And then it shows us the way he approaches Jesus as well. And this is pretty significant. It says that a crowd had welcomed Jesus, and then Jairus came right up and fell at Jesus' feet. So there's a crowd following Jesus, because at this time Jesus had sort of become a local celebrity, and people were following him, and he had healed a few people and performed a few miracles. So people are flocking to Jesus, and at this point there's a crowd around him, and Jairus is not deterred by all the people or by all the crowd, and instead he just walks right up to Jesus in the middle of this crowd and falls at Jesus' feet. And so in order to do that, in order to kind of make your way through a crowd, Jairus must have had some kind of significance, right? Some kind of influence, especially if he was a named leader in the synagogue. When people saw Jairus, they weren't going to still stand there in his way. They probably would have seen Jairus and go, oh, that's Jairus. I'm not going to get in his way. I'm going to get out of the way. He's important. And Jairus felt the confidence and he felt the influence enough that he had the right to walk up in this crowd and approach Jesus with all the other people clamoring to get Jesus' attention. Jairus, maybe he was just very bold and confident, but I think this is showing us just the influence and the power that Jairus had. And so he walks right up to Jesus' face and asks him, Jesus, will you come and heal my sick daughter? And he invites Jesus to his house. And he believes that his daughter is important enough for Jesus to stop whatever he's doing and to make a detour and to go heal his daughter. So this is the first person we're introduced to in this story, Jairus. He's this man who's important and powerful and has cultural significance and can walk up through a crowd and approach Jesus himself. Now the story keeps going. We have the next two verses here. Verse 43 and 44. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Okay, so what do we see that's different here in her description and Jairus' description? Just about everything, right? So the first thing we learn about her is she's not a man. What is she? She's a woman. You guys are so smart, man. You guys, Rapid City Christian School, doing a good job. Okay, so she's a woman. And what is her name? We don't know her name, right? It doesn't even give us her name. And the reason it doesn't give us her name is probably because it wasn't significant. No one around would have known her name either. If they would have just given us her name, it'd have been like, okay, great, who was that? She was this unnamed woman who most people wouldn't have known even if it gave us her name. And then it also told us that she was sick, that she had been struggling with this illness where she had been bleeding for 12 years. And so now, not only is she an unnamed woman, but she's sick. And this particular sickness that she had would have made her ceremonially unclean. And what that meant is that she was not able to go to the synagogue to worship, and she was not able to just move freely in public. She would have been actually treated like the lepers were. And what the lepers had to do when they walked around is they had to tell everyone and announce that they're unclean, and they'd walk around saying, I'm unclean, so that people could avoid them. And they were essentially cast out of society. They wouldn't have been able to live with their family. They wouldn't have been able to travel or shop or to worship in the same way as other people because this illness made her unclean. She was quite literally an outcast in society, an outcast. And I know that being an outcast can kind of be cool sometimes, right? Like some people will self-identify as like an outcast because it means you're edgy or you're alternative and it's really cool. And I know it was a church that I worked in a few years ago where we had this small group that met at our church, but none of them actually went to our church. And they called themselves the Outcast Group. And they had flyers all around the church for the Outcast Group meeting here and there. And when I first got to the church, I just thought it was interesting that none of them went to our church, but that they still met there. And so I just thought, I would go introduce myself to them. And so when I went and I met with them, I just talked to them and found out that this was a group of people who had been from a bunch of different churches in town, but none of them felt like they really fit in. And so that's why they just said, well, we're going to gather together and be this group of outcasts together. And the town that I lived in at the time was a little country town over in Oregon where everybody basically owned a big farm. And so I understood that if, you didn't own 100 acres, you basically didn't fit in. And so that's kind of how they felt. That, everybody here just owns all these things and is these big-time farmers, and I'm not, so I don't fit in. And our church, it was kind of unique at the time because we had all these big-time farmers. We even had a small group that was just plum farmers. A group of people who met together, and the reason they met together was all of them were plum farmers. And when I visited that small group, I can tell you, I didn't really feel like I fit in either. I felt like I was an outcast. And so I had just been talking to them, and I said, okay, so you're a plum farmer. And I said that to one guy. And the one guy goes, no, I'm not a plum farmer, I'm a prune farmer. And I don't know if you know anything about prunes, but I just kind of assumed that prunes were just dried up plums, that there's the same thing, right? And so I said, I didn't realize that you could grow prunes like that. And they all laughed at me and said, this city slicker, he doesn't know that prunes are grown. What does he think they come from? I'm like, well, that's not what I meant. I just thought they were maybe dried later. I don't know. But so I understood that these people maybe didn't always feel like they fit in. But nonetheless, I invited these people to say, hey, I know that this church is kind of unique. We've got all these plum farmers and prune farmers, and you don't want to mix those two up. They'll get really offended. But try coming to church sometime. See how they treat you. See what it's like. And so this whole group of people one day just decided to come. And they visited church. And guess what? Everyone was very nice to them and loved them and welcomed them in. And they realized, oh, we're not actually outcasts, and these things don't actually matter. And they all made friends very well. Well, that wouldn't have actually been an option for this lady. She would have had no chance to just be welcomed in because of this illness. She was cast out of society. She was not able to be near him. And then, do you remember how Jairus approached Jesus? He just walked right up to him, right? Well, how did this lady approach Jesus? Touched his cloak. She was just like sneaking through the crowd, right? She didn't go right up in front. She didn't spread the crowd so that she could get close to Jesus. She's like squeezing her way through here, and without saying anything, just reaches out and touches the edge of Jesus' coat there. And then in verse 45, Jesus notices this. He says, "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." And then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. And then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And so, do you see the differences between this lady and Jairus? And she was a sick, unnamed woman who had to sneak through and touch Jesus' coat. And then she was healed because of that. And she was healed because of that, and it was so miraculous that she told everyone. She told everyone, and telling everyone was significant here because she was basically admitting that she had broken the law. She wasn't allowed to just be sneaking through the crowd and making her way to Jesus. Everyone that she bumped into and touched would have essentially been made ceremonially unclean at that point. But nonetheless, Jesus didn't correct her, did he? Most people would have been tempted to say, well, you shouldn't have been here and you better be healed now. But no, Jesus actually stopped and he noticed that she touched him. And then when she told Jesus that she had been healed, Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And so I think most people in this situation would be tempted to view Jairus the way that your average person views other people. Jairus is this important man with significance and power, and I'm on my way to help him, and that's really important. And this insignificant, unnamed woman who's sick and shouldn't even be out in public and shouldn't be touching anyone shouldn't get in the way of this important task. And that's how most people would think, right? That's how most people view others. But Jesus is completely different, right? Jesus doesn't have any regard for the way that cultures view those things, and instead, Jesus stops for this woman. And Jesus didn't think that she was any less valuable or important than Jairus. He simply saw her as a daughter who was sick. And that's what he was going to do anyway, right? He was going to heal Jairus' sick daughter. And if he's on his way to heal a sick daughter, well, this fits right in with his mission, right? She might be sick and unnamed and insignificant, but Jesus still views her as a daughter of God. And so he's going to stop. He doesn't care if she's rich, poor, sick, any of that. And he prioritizes her, and he stops. And this is how Jesus sees people. That Jesus doesn't see people based on the different cultural things that we might look at them with. You know, I know especially in middle school and high school, it gets really easy to see people for, which, is it Jersey Day or something? Did I miss the memo? I forgot my memo. But you see everyone for the jerseys they wear, or for this, or for what they're like, or what sport they play. And we get really good at forming cliques and little circles in schools, right? And we don't view everyone as simply a son with a sick daughter, or as simply a daughter who needs to be healed, right? That this is something that Jesus is going to have to change in us in order for us to continually be made more like him, to be able to serve anyone and everyone, to be able to serve not just the rich and powerful people, And not just the sick people that look more needy, because some people might be tempted to just ignore Jairus then as well, but to be able to serve everyone the way Jesus serves everyone. But that won't happen until we see people the way Jesus sees people. That's how Jesus saw her. And the second thing we're going to look at is how Jesus saw problems differently, right? Jesus saw problems differently. He said to this woman, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And this phrase was really common that he said, "Go in peace." It would be like us saying, "Have a great day," or "I'll see you later." And then often we don't plan to see people later. That's just kind of what you say. And the phrase that Jesus said here was, "Shalom, go in shalom." And it had become really common, but it didn't start out that way. It started out as being this greeting to remind everyone about the peace and the shalom and the wholeness of God. And Jesus, being God, would have meant the intentional meaning, not just the common, everyday meaning of it. That shalom means the way God meant it to be. And we know that when God first created the world and in the Garden of Eden, that it was good, and he called it good. And then sin came in and messed it all up. And so shalom is this idea that one day God will put things back to the way that they're supposed to be. And that in this fallen world and in this life, that whenever God heals people, or whenever Jesus would heal an illness like this, he was reminding us of the shalom, of the wholeness, of the peace that he intends for the world, and that one day he will bring back. And so when Jesus says this, he's reminding everyone that this wholeness and this healing that this woman has just received is something that he is going to put back and make whole for everyone. And this is Jesus reminding us that our problems, regardless of how big, even if it's something that someone had suffered with for 12 years, is not that big of a problem for Jesus, but that Jesus intends to bring shalom back and to fix these things. You see, sometimes we look at the problems in the world when it comes to like serving others, or we look at the problems in our lives and we just think they're way too big for us to handle. They're way too big for us to do anything about it. You know, I'm just a high schooler, I'm just a middle schooler, I'm just a normal person. And if I'm going to serve others, I'll just serve others who have simple little problems. I'll just help out with the small things because I can't possibly do anything significant with these big problems. But Jesus actually invites us to view problems differently, right? In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16 and 18, the Apostle Paul wrote this. He said, "Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. And so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." And so what Jesus is essentially saying is that as big as our problems look, in comparison to the peace and the wholeness that he has to offer, they're actually small. And that's not to minimize our problems or to minimize our pain or to say that they're not big deals, but it's to say that his peace and his shalom and his healing is even bigger. And so it's in comparison that you see these problems. And Jesus is saying, well, compared to me, this woman's sickness, not that big of a problem. That in light of me, I'm much bigger, much grander, and much bigger than these problems. So jump back into the story, verse 49 here. So that had just happened. He had just healed this woman. And while Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's mother and father. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned to her, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat, because dying makes you hungry, apparently. And her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. And so the problem for Jairus looked pretty big too, right? This woman had this illness and this sickness that she had been dealing with for 12 years, and that looks like a big problem, and all the doctors weren't able to fix it, but yet Jesus healed it. But what is even bigger problem than a sickness? Just being dead. That's a pretty big problem. That seems, a little too hard for anyone to tackle. You know that no doctor is going to be able to fix that situation. But it's right after Jesus heals this woman, and Jairus actually gets to witness this healing, that he's given the news that his daughter dies. And then Jesus says to him, don't be afraid, just believe, and you'll be healed. That Jesus is saying, this problem is actually not too big. This problem is actually not too big for me. Just believe in me. Just believe in me. And just like how this woman just grabbing the edge of his coat was able to heal this woman, Jesus comes to this dead little girl and says, get up. Or in some versions of the Bible, it'll just say, arise. And Jesus speaks one word, and this dead girl is made alive. So compared to Jesus and what he's able to do, this problem is not too big. And this last thing that we see is that Jesus sees power differently. Right? We've talked about kind of the cultural power that these two people have. There's Jairus, leader of the synagogue, a man with all this authority and all this ability and all this wealth. And then there's this woman, this sick woman, who isn't even named. We don't know much about her. And there's a huge power imbalance. But nonetheless, to the rich guy Jairus, Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed. And then to the woman who had bled for 12 years, Jesus says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. That essentially, whether you have great earthly power or whether you have none at all and you're insignificant and nobody knows your name, that neither the lack of power or the presence of earthly power actually makes any difference, because the only one with any power is Jesus. The only one with any ability to truly make a difference is Jesus. The only one who's able to actually tackle these big problems is Jesus. And so it's actually the same prayer and the same message that Jesus gives to these two very different people. Most would be tempted to think, well, Jairus has all the resources and the ability. He should be able to find a doctor or someone who's going to fix his sick daughter. And this woman, she has nothing. She's just going to have to be sick the rest of her life. She has no way out. But Jesus sees power differently because he knows that he is the only one who truly possesses power. Now, I don't know if you've ever played this game before. It's called 9 Square in the Air. Who's played it? Has anyone ever played 9 Square in the Air? Okay, so it's a pretty fun game. If you've ever heard of Camp Halawasa down in Hot Springs, that's a camp that I have served at a few times, and I get to be on the board at. And what I really like about 9 Square in the Air is that I'm a 6-foot-tall man, and I get to play against little middle schoolers. It's a lot of fun, right? When you're a lot bigger than these little kids, and for someone like me who is only ever like a second-team all-league athlete, getting to beat little middle schoolers in games makes me feel really good about myself. So it's a lot of fun. But if you know anything about 9 Square in the Air, you know that the square where that guy with the ball is currently, that's the king square. And you start on the other side, and your goal is to get to the king square, right? So you're going to get everyone out, or to get enough people ahead of you in line out to get to the king square. Now, when I play with little middle schoolers, the smartest thing for them to do if they want to move up and get to the king square is not to go for me, right? Because if they go for me, I'm just gonna spike it on them and get them out. I'm going to show them what real power looks like, right? Because it's compared to little middle schoolers, I actually do have some. If they were smart, they would just be my teammate and be on my side, right? And never actually go for me. And then I'm not going to go for them. I'm just going to go for everyone else. And they should just ally themselves with real power. Instead of trying to do it themselves, instead of trying to be like tricky and sneaky and trying to get it out on me, because then that's just going to make me get them out. And oftentimes when it comes to our problems or when it comes to serving, we do a very similar thing, don't we? Where we think, I can figure this out on my own. I can do it on my own. I've got the power. I'm a 4'2" middle schooler. I can take this guy out, right? But no. Compared to the problems we face and compared to the power of Jesus, we can't accomplish anything. And so this is the invitation of Jesus, to just ally ourselves with him as the one with real power. And so this is how we serve like Jesus, that Jesus is a servant. And it's until we start to view people and problems and power like Jesus, we won't serve like him. Good job. We ended right on time, guys. Hey, thanks so much for being here.